Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this big guy, the Ferrum Forge Mordax. First off, I want to thank my viewer John for loaning this guy to me. I appreciate it very much, and it's a knife I've heard about and seen a great deal of, but never actually had a chance to handle. So, thanks, John. Let's do a quick size comparison on the Mordax here. Here is your Spyderco Delica. Here is your Ontario Rat number 1, which is around in the same class in terms of blade length overall, when you don't count the choil. Here is your Ontario Rat number 2. Your Spyderco Sleesh Bowie, your Graham Razel, and your Chris Reeve Knives Small Sabenza. Why not, right? So, yeah, there's your size comparison. And one interesting thing about the name, it's kind of an interesting name. Mordax is actually Latin for cutting or biting, which is kind of clever. Like, oh, it cuts. Look, it's the adjective. It's a cutting sort of knife. Great. So anyways, that's what the whole Mordax thing is about. It's not an Uruk-hai general from Lord of the Rings, although, frankly, that's a pretty plausible explanation as well. So let's go on ahead and go into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this particular pocket knife. So, on the good side, I'm a lover of the details. If they're getting the details right, they've got my heart. And they've gotten a lot of details right here. So, for instance, take a look at this pivot. It's a Torx driver, so at the end of the day, you can take it apart just fine, but it's absolutely beautiful. They've created sort of a tri-wing arrangement. This is a really nicely done pivot, in that it's very custom, but it's also very workable. So I like that. It's a great little detail. There are lots of other ones. If we look at the lock bar, we can see that they've got a little zigzag in the lock bar in the middle there. Completely unnecessary, but really neat and unusual and different. Also, look at the tolerance here. The gap between the lock bar and the knife, very, very small, helps to keep crud from getting up inside there. On the blade itself, there were plenty of really nice details. You've got this bevel. I don't know, this may be too big to be a swedge. Maybe it's still a swedge. But this little surface at the top of the blade here is very nice. And you'll note that the finish is actually consistent throughout. They've done this beautiful satin finish that I'll talk about in a bit here on the spine of the blade as well, which is really nice. There were some other really nice details. The standoffs here are very nice. They're subtle, they're small, and they're anodized to match the pivot screw here. Nice thing. The screws themselves seem to be nicely made. I tend to like a bigger Torx driver, and those are pretty decent. And then finally, on the detail front, take a look at this edge bevel here. We just don't have a quick transition to flat. You've got this little 45-degree-ish angle on the side here, and that really makes this guy rest much better in the hand than a knife where it's just absolutely flat and then suddenly absolutely flat in the other direction. So the details, by and large, are there. There's some other really nice, bigger issues, too, on this guy. The spring clip, although I don't love the position, is very good. It's just a chunk of titanium here, but the spring tension is great. The thickness of it is very nice. I'm a big fan of this spring clip. And also, it's got enough ramp to get into your pocket. Absolutely no problem. It has a lock bar insert, which is built in there, which is very nice, and also serves as an over-travel stop, which you can't argue with, 100%. The blade on this guy, I really love the aesthetics on this blade, and I'm going to try and show it off here, but it's really something you have to behold in person. It's almost like a mirror acid wash or something along these lines. The flats up here have a nice silver thing, and then over here it's a bronzed sort of mirror wash. I just don't know what it is, but I know that I love it, because you get that same dark feeling that you get on an acid wash blade, but it still feels very smooth and clean. And I love this blade finish a great deal. The blade itself is N690 steel, which is not top end, but it's certainly fine for the job. And, so this blade, the aesthetics of the blade on this are just spectacular. And they really are showing a mastery here that I very much appreciate. They're really trying hard to get this right. Yeah, I just love it. Next thing that I'll point out is actually really unusual, and that's this little screw here. There's actually kind of a dial-a-detent system, where if you turn this screw in one direction or the other, the detent ball itself pulls forward or pushes out. And that means that if you turn this screw a couple of turns, you can make the knife completely unopenable. The detent is too strong. But if you, pull it back a couple, then there is no detent whatsoever. And the beautiful part about this is that you can dial in the detent pretty straightforwardly. And that's really kind of nice. In a lot of ways, it's unique, it's different. It means that you're going to be able to adjust this if you get you can really make this your own in that particular way. You may have to adjust it periodically, but that's kind of a cool innovation. It's not something I've seen before, and I like it very much. And speaking of the detent, the action on this guy is very good. I mean, obviously the detent is fine because it's exactly how I want it to be. But the shutting on it is pretty smooth. It does drop shut in a pretty easy way. It's very, very happily smooth. The blade is very heavy, so of course it would be, but I would say this is just as smooth, about as smooth as the Graham Razel, which is a really, really nice smooth action. And then, of course, the opening is pleasurable as well. So, yeah, there you go. That's the good on this guy. You've got some really great details to start with. You've got a great spring clip, a nice lock bar insert. The blade on this guy is just so masterfully freaking finished. I love it so much. The dial of the tent thing is nice, and the action is very good. Let's go into the great. What's great about this knife to me is the feeling in the hand, because it is really great in the hand. It's not so much ergonomics in the Spyderco sense of you've got ramps for everything and smoothing where you need smoothing and bump. It's much simpler than that. It's like the balance and the heft and, for some reason, this knife just feels like it belongs in my hand 100%. I have it in the hand. It's like, yeah. There we go. That's perfect. That works. And I can sit here and I can get work done. Yeah, there were some hot spots here, but it just feels really, really great. And I'm struggling to put this into words, honestly, but whatever the heck it is, it's pretty excellent. And I get the feeling that when you pick one up, you're going to be like, oh, that's what he was talking about. So, yeah, that's what's great about this is that it really does feel excellent in the hand, like it was really made to live there. So, that's absolutely great. And a nice departure from a lot of folding knives where the feeling in the hand is kind of on taking a back burner to some other effects. So, great job there, Ferrum Forge. I don't know what you did, but by God, I'm glad you did it. So on the bad side, first some nitpicks. There are a couple of hot spots on this guy. The clip here, as well as the back of the blade being as, the spine having this work on the end. There's not a whole lot for your thumb to rest on. Not a big deal, and overall the knife is still pretty damn ergonomic, but it is something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is the dial of detent system is a potential point of failure. It actually does stick up slightly beyond the scales at the level of adjustment I'm using, and so you might want to use a little bit of a very weak Loctite to keep that in place so that your detent doesn't change during the course of the knife. It's not a huge deal, but it's something to keep in mind and think about. The blade is a little bit close to the edge on the back side here, to the extent where, my fingers can very easily go in there and touch the blade. If you keep the very edge of this blade in the back here very sharp, you might have yourself a bad time. It's not a big deal, and it's not as bad as on some other knives where it is right in the corner there as a Cody Utzler custom, but it is something to keep in mind. And so if you got small fingers, yeah. Then I'm not a big fan of the flipper tab. Because it's got this rounded sort of feeling and there's no texturing whatsoever, I can usually flip it. It's just, it always feels a little bit insecure. I'd like maybe a little texturing or even a little bit of a hook sort of affair, something along the lines of what you've got on your Shirogorov knee on there. It's not the end of the world, it works, but I don't love the flipper tab here. Now on to more substantial criticisms. I don't like the free spinning pivot here. If you start spinning this screw, the default setting is for it to just keep spinning in the back there. It's just not a great thing for disassembly whatsoever, because if you use a little bit of Loctite on this guy, particularly if you use the wrong Loctite, you might never get this knife back apart again. If you're going to do a small pivot like this, you need to make some sort of a D shape. You need to make it so this pivot can't spin. That's honestly, I'm right on the edge of calling this one ugly, but knowing that a lot of people don't disassemble knives, I'm going to let it pass as bad. But that's not great, and especially when the contact surface is weirdly small, at least with like the Shirogorov Neon, you've got this big pad to apply friction to. I really worry that this could get stuck pretty straightforwardly with the free spinning pivot, so I don't like that. Another thing that I'm not a big fan of is the weight here. This is not a lightweight knife in any way. You're looking at 5.4 ounces here. It's lighter than the Graham Razel, which I do carry on a regular basis, but it is still not a trivial weight here. You will feel this in your pants as you're carrying it, and it may be a part of what gives it that sort of heft that I like so damn much, but it is a heavy knife, and so you got to keep that in mind. Next issue for me is that it's a little bit on the thick behind the edge side. This initial bevel is fairly shallow, and if this were my knife, one of the first things I'd be doing is reprofiling the edge a little bit so you get a little bit more, and get a slightly more acute edge rather than this sort of thing that we got now. And that's kind of a problem that's exacerbated by the simple fact that the knife is way too thick overall. This would be a much more compelling knife to me with a much thinner blade. The blade on this guy, on the whole, is, I would say, about the same thickness, if not maybe a little thicker than the Graham Razel, although it doesn't look that way because the top of the blade is rounded off, but it's a very, here, I'll use the flipper tab here. It's a little thicker than the Graham Razel. That's really, really thick, and I don't see why it needs to be. I think this would be a much more compelling knife with a thinner blade, which would make it a better cutting tool, and then you could add some interior milling, which would not only knock down the weight a little bit, but would help the balance again, too. So that's kind of bad, is that thickness. And then finally, on the bad side, the price. These guys went for about $500. They're tougher to find new these days, but you can get them on the secondary market around that too. And that's, honestly, it's high. Although I will say, with the amount of care that they've given on things like the blade finish and whatnot, it's not far off. I don't think you're going to get ripped off if you pay $500 for one of these. So, but the price is definitely up there relative to a lot of knives. So that's your bad. You got some hot spots. The dial of the tent can be a point of failure if you're not careful with it. The blade is a little close to the edge in the back here. The flipper tab doesn't bring me so much joy. The free spinning pivot is honestly really negative. I don't like that at all. The knife is heavy. It's thick behind the edge, and it's thick overall. And I think it could be much more compelling without that thickness. And then finally, $500 is not a small chunk of change. Let's talk about the ugly. The ugly thing about this knife is that it's very grip dependent in terms of the detent because the clip is resting directly on the lock bar here. It's natural to want to grip the knife tightly as you're flipping, and if you're gripping the knife tightly and it's pressing against the lock bar, that increases the strength of the detent, and thus it increases the amount of strength required to pop this, to actually flip the knife. And so with this knife, you really need to make sure that your fingers are not resting on the lock bar, but are resting elsewhere, and then it flips like a dream. But then you don't have a really great grip on it. Like I said, the biggest issue here is that the clip is resting against the lock bar rather than the frame. If the clip was resting against the frame itself, then putting a little extra force into the clip would just put it into the frame and the tent would be unaffected. And it would also, frankly, give this knife a little bit nicer cant in the pocket if the lock bar was a little bit more like this. I'm sorry, if the pocket clip was a little more like this. But either way, you will learn to use this knife no problem. I have in the time I've carried it. But at the same time, I just don't love it. I really wish that they'd done that little tiny tweak that would have made this a lot better in that way and would have removed this problem altogether. It's worth saying that this is mitigated by the dial of detent system. If you use a lot of pressure when you open it, you turn the detent down a little bit naturally. But that's not a problem this knife should have. All they needed to do was tweak this angle this much, and it would have been a much better knife for it. But that's really fixable for the Mordax No. 2 or even just a future version. There we go. So that's the ugly, is that this is very, very sensitive to your grip in terms of the detent strength and the ability to flip the thing really at all. So what's the final verdict? This is a great knife. It's simple, it's well built, the action is really good, the details are really good. I mean, this blade finish is just masterful. And it is great in the hand. Ferrum Forge has impressed the heck out of me with this knife. I mean, yeah, it's not perfect. They need to fix the clip issue and they need to fix the free spinning pivot, but it's damn good. Its problems aren't so bad in the grand scheme of things. It's also very much not my style. It's a little too heavy, it's way too thick, it's a little folding pry bar-ish in its construction, and it's almost a little bit Lord of the Rings in the attitude. I mean, even the name kind of captures it in many ways. Mordax, I use the Mordax to cleave the Orcs in two. And, I mean, that's awesome, don't get me wrong. But I go wizard, not barbarian, and so this isn't necessarily my approach here. So I'm in this weird position where it's a knife that I don't particularly care for, but I highly recommend. I respect the heck out of the Mordax and out of Ferrum Forge. This is a really excellent knife, even with its flaws, and Ferrum Forge is doing really excellent knife making. This is a really, really impressive piece, no matter what. And it is a pretty damn good EDC choice if you're looking for thick, heavy, and brutish, and you're looking to level up your barbarian a little bit here. It's not quite a gem to me, just because, like I said, it's not my style. But if you're interested, 100%, you have my blessing. The Mordax is a really nice knife. I'm going to be looking at some other Ferrum Forge stuff. I've got an Archbishop on the table now from my buddy Jim to review, and I'm hoping to take a look at a Scepter here one of these days, too. But, Ferrum Forge has impressed the heck out of me. They're on my radar now, and although this guy's not to my style, maybe some of their other stuff will be. So, there you go. I guess that's my conclusion, is that it's a great knife. I do recommend it, even if I don't love it myself. There you go. Hope this has been interesting, that your barbarian is able to slay any orcs necessary with the Mordax of truth and power, and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful and orcless rest of your day. Bye now.